I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. Our speaker tonight, Tracy is Professor of U.S. History at the University of Louisville, where she has served as co-director of the Oral History Center. She's the author of To Live Peaceably Together, the American Friends Service Committee's Campaign for Open Housing, and Civil Rights in the Gateway to the South, Louisville, Kentucky, 1945 to 1980. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Dr. Kmeyer.
Okay, thanks for having me. Thanks for turning out. I'm going to keep this informal and do a lot of the reading from the book. The whole point of the book was to let people associated with Kentucky Shakespeare tell their stories. So it makes sense to heavily rely on their words here today. As Greg Maupin, the dramaturg for the company, once said when he and I were talking about this, well, we, pointing to him and his wife Abigail, actually wrote the book, right? So yes. So in honor to sort of honor that, I'm going to do a lot of reading it from it. And like Patrick said, I'll save questions for the end because I love answering questions about this book and this company. I guess in a way you could say it started in 2015 when I went to see Taming of the Shrew in Central Park, and I was blown away by the performance, and I became a regular, attending pretty much every production at least once from that point on. In 2019, in the early fall of 2019, I attended a volunteer event, which was basically to encourage people to sign up to do some volunteer work for the company. I thought it'd be a good way to give back after enjoying their work for so long. By the way, there is another one of those volunteer events coming up that I am now hosting. So if you know later anybody wants to hear about how you can volunteer for the company, I can sign you up. Well, during that conversation, Matt Wallace, who's the artistic director of the company, mentioned that their anniversary was coming up. And I thought, well, instead of handing out playbills at a production, maybe I could do something in my own expertise and help them to document their history. So for that spring of 2020, I planned an oral history class. I recruited a group of students who had either expressed interest in theater history or oral history before. And together they came up with what kinds of questions to ask. They designed the interviews together. We've got a list of potential interviewees from Amy Attaway, the associate artistic director of the company. And each of the students did a couple interviews, transcribed them, and we brought them together. The idea was that summer we would do some kind of presentation of the material in the park. But of course, that was summer of 2020, and there was nothing going on in the park. So kind of talking to Amy about what should we do with this material, we considered an online exhibit, and I started to work on that, but I don't really have that expertise, I'll be honest. I don't know very much about that sort of thing. But what really struck me is just how rich the material was. You know, in grading the students' work, I'd had to read all their transcripts in detail and really thought this material was so beautiful, and the use of words was so beautiful that it lent itself to a book. So I decided to do that. And I've done books, so I figured, well, that I have an expertise in, that I can do. So I started looking at the material and realized pretty quickly, the other sort of aha moment was that it naturally fell into 5 sections or acts, just like a Shakespeare play. So it seemed to be kind of fated then that this should end up as a book. So I want to make clear what the nature of the book. There is introductory material in my voice, the introduction to the book, the introduction to each act, and then some text between the narrators. But the vast majority of the book is the words from the interviews, which I have edited into a sort of presentable, readable form. So the idea that I really sort of carry with me about this book is the goal is to transport people to Central Park, to a performance, and really have them sort of see that experience from the point of view of the people who are creating the art. In part, the name of the book is meant to reflect being in the park under the Greenwood tree. And really, University of Kentucky Press artists, really, what a great job they did on the cover. I had totally I sent them a picture of the stage. I said, use this for your cover. And they were like, no. And they sent me this drawing instead. And I was like, yes, that's much better. It's actually, I think, a beautiful cover. So they did a great job and sort of, again, conveying that sense of being in the park. One last thing about the title, I do have to give credit again to Greg Maupin. I'm in a book club that is all Shakespeare. We just read Shakespeare. And I had sent a note to that club saying, give me a title for the book. No, all the world's the stage. No, the play's the thing. I did a book on school desegregation and I said, no school bus on the cover. Well, it was sort of the same idea. You don't want something very stereotypical, right? So Greg Maupin came up with this. It is from a line from The One in the Woods. Oh, not All's Well That Ends Well. As You Like It. Thank you. I knew it was one of the A ones. It's actually a line from As You Like It. So that's the kind of the nature of the book. I'd like to elaborate and share some about the content of the book. Again, by drawing on some of the interviews. Now, Act 1 is the plot. It is the original purpose of the interviews, which was to tell the history of the company, to sort of document its origins, how it grew over time, the changes it went through, and how we get to today. So it does start with Doug Ramey, who was the founder of the Carriage House Players, and there's an Old Louisville connection here, in that the Carriage House Players rehearsed and performed in a carriage house on 5th Street. They did a mix of classical plays with an occasional Shakespeare piece. In the late 1950s, there was sort of a revival of interest in Shakespeare, both in the United States and in Britain. And so the Carriage House Players started to do a little bit more Shakespeare. There was also a big burst of enthusiasm at that time for outdoor theater in the summer. This taps into sort of the expansion of leisure time, the expansion with the automobile, people being able to travel for vacations. And so a number of cities started to launch outdoor theater festivals. Sometimes it was big splashy musicals, but Shakespeare festivals started to pop up. Now, the difference about them, so the first one was in New York City. It's the first free outdoor Shakespeare festival, but it's ticketed. You have to stand in line. Not everybody can get in, and you have to get a ticket. Douglas Ramey's innovation was to make it completely free and completely unticketed. The first performance actually was during an African-American organization-sponsored art festival in Central Park, where Ramey was invited to have the company do just a few scenes of Much Ado About Nothing. But that was so popular that they were supposed to just do it one night, that they did it for several nights in a row. And then they decided that the next summer they would go back and do a full season of plays in the park. It became annual, and after Ramey retired, passed to Becky Jo Schneider, who as a teenager had worked with Ramey, doing everything from costume design to acting in lead roles, including Taming of the Shrew, to go back to that story. The book does cover what many people in the company call the, quote, dark days as well. This was a period in the late 90s through the sort of 2013, when the number of plays in the park declined, attendance declined. Some of this has to do with demographic change. Some of it has to do with air conditioning, as people had other things that they could do in the summertime. And then there was a series of 2 directors in a row who were hired from outside, one from the East Coast, one from the West Coast, and they made a series of artistic decisions that alienated both local artists and local audiences, and really brought the company to a low point in the summer of 2013, when it looked like it might completely go under. And there was a big controversy where a play had to be canceled at the last minute. Had to do with a restraining order by an actress against her husband, who was the director. It was a mess. So it looked pretty bad. But then came the turnaround, and what many narrators refer to as the Renaissance of Kentucky Shakespeare. And one of the really fun things about this project, I thought, was hearing these stories and the enthusiasm for this period, this kind of rebuilding period. When Matt Wallace, who had been an actor for the company, but had been bypassed for the directorship. Lots of people had wanted him to have the job, but he had been bypassed for it. He was finally offered the position, and he throws himself into putting on, in his first season, three full shows plus pre-shows by local amateur groups, and struggled with bringing the company back from the brink of sort of financial ruin as well. I always like, this is one of my favorite stories, so I always like to start with it. This comes from Matt Wallace, and he's talking about some of the hard times of that first year. He talks about there's a bit, he just kind of comes across the bill from a lawyer that hadn't been paid. He comes across a tax bill that hadn't been paid. And he's, trying to look on the bright side. And he talks about how, quote, at the end of that first day, I went to Tina, who is his wife, a fellow actress, and said, let's just go to the park. Tina and my two daughters met at the park, and we got ice cream, and we went back out there just to be there and connect with, why are we here? My daughter Anna ran up on stage. She was tiny, like 2 or 3. She ran up and I said, go do some Shakespeare on stage. So she ran up on stage and she said, let's slip the dogs of war. And it was that battle cry. I know, I love that. It always makes me almost cry. It was that battle cry that gave me some energy. And I think that, for one, that gives you sort of a sense of how theatrical these narrators are. It turns out that actors are really good at talking, which was one of the joys of the project. So that sort of wraps up the plot part. The second chapter is what's a surprise to me. One of the things that came up in the interviews, was really obvious in the interviews, is how they talked about doing their art. We didn't go into this project thinking that was going to be a big theme, but that certainly came out. And so they talked about what it's like to put a season together, about rehearsals, about opening night jitters. They described the nuances of acting, costume design, lighting. Abigail Maupin explained to me, sitting outside of coffee shop, how she learned to hold her body in different ways, depending on the time period setting. Donna Lawrence Downs talked about how she picked fabrics. And fun fact, you have to pick a fabric that's not going to smell when it gets hot and sweaty, right? And the actors also, interestingly, admitted that they all make mistakes, and they shared how they recovered from that on stage. And one of my favorite stories comes from a young man named Braden McCampbell, relatively recently with the company. He joins the company in about 2016, so he's relatively recent compared to some of the other people. But he talks about how one particular actor would recover from a mistake. So he says, I used to beat myself up horribly for it anytime I forgot a line. Hey, I completely forgot. I had to say something there. My bad. I'm sorry. Or just, aw, crap. In the middle of whatever, your brain goes, and we're thinking about ice cream. Oh, wait, we're supposed to say something after the sword fight. Ugh. John Huffman, who was my mentor, helps a lot when your mentor is somebody like John Huffman. He's got a cool little trick where if he goes up on a line, he will re-say the line before it or some part of a monologue. He does it so smoothly that people don't realize he's saying a line from something else. I've only caught it once, and I asked John O'Brien, who's another actor with the company, what just happened? Did he just repeat that line? And he's like, yeah, we call it Huffmaning now. I have to tell this story, and I'm going to embarrass the heck out of her. My daughter's in the audience, and it reminds me of the first time she ever did Shakespeare. She was Antonio in The Tempest, and she gives his big speech about killing the king, and then she gave the big speech again the second time, and I was just like, without skipping a beat, she just kept going, and did it a second time. So I think that for most people, though, the favorite part of the book is going to be Act 3, which is called In the Park. And here, the goal is to sort of capture that experience, what it is like to do outdoor theater. And Christian Wiltshire, a young actor with the company, I think summed that up with 2 quotes that I start the chapter with. He says, there's nothing like a perfect summer night at Kentucky Shakespeare in the Park. It's the second half of the play, the sun's gone down, and you see lights bouncing off the amazing trees. It's just really, really special, almost a religious experience that you just can't get at too many other places. Later in his interview, he then added, I think that, speaking of also the experience of performing live in the park, I think that my final words would be, Greg Maupin sweats way too much. And I did ask Greg's permission to use that quote in the book. So sticking with the sublime side just for a minute, I always like to use this particular quote because it says something to me about the experience of doing oral history. So when you do oral history, you're listening to the person talk, and every once in a while, there's a moment that is just, it's like, that's it. That's the book. That's in the book. That's the quote. That's why I'm here. And that moment happened for me. I didn't do a whole lot of the interviews because the students did most of them. I did a few follow-up interviews, but I did reserve the right to interview John Huffman myself. So he very nicely came to my office, and we did it at my office. And he's telling the story about, for him, what it's like to perform live in Central Park in the evening in the great outdoors. And I said, that's why I write these books. So it said, last year we did King Lear, and I was very fortunate enough to play the title role. My first big scene was up high on a platform. It was still daylight when we start. We start about 8 o'clock, so it's still daylight. I discovered in this scene that while I was up there, I could plant myself so that the sun became a spotlight right on my face. I was kind of overwhelmed by that. I know, I was like, what an image. To be outside speaking Shakespeare, one of the greatest plays ever written, and the sunlight is a spotlight on me, it's just a wonderful experience. In the park, you have people coming and going, especially at the beginning of the evening. You have a lot of people who haven't quite settled down. But as the sun starts to go down, as the story starts to unfold, then this group of anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people just lean in. You've got hawks, you've got owls, you've got night critters, you've got sirens in the background and airplanes overhead, but you've got people leaning in to hear it. And it's kind of wonderful to just watch them be drawn in. So for me, it's so evocative of what it actually really is like to be, at least in the audience, but to hear it from the performers. And a lot of the performers went on to talk about that connection with the audience that they feel, that they could literally look somebody in the eye when they're doing their aside or something. I remember during Comedy of Errors last time they did it, a real hit moment was on actor named Neil Robertson playing one of the comic twins, comes up and he stumbles up on stage, and some little kid in the front row laughed because he had stumbled, and he turns around and he goes to the kid like this. And, I'm thinking that kid's going to remember that moment, right? So there's a lot of these wonderful sort of connection to the audience stories. And of course, it isn't always lovely. The summer nights in Louisville can be hot. They can be stormy. There's great stories about storms breaking out. In one case, Braden McCampbell and Neil Robertson are doing a sword fight, and just as their swords hit, big metal long sticks hit, a crack of lightning goes off overhead. They have been interrupted by owls and squirrels and dogs and drunks taking a pee on the side of the stage. That literally happened one time. And of course, as anybody in Old Louisville knows, airplanes. Right? Airplanes going over quite low and quite loudly. Sometimes it seems like you can even almost touch them, and you can certainly hear them, and they interrupt the show. So what's an actor to do? Well, Phil Cherry had a particular experience with planes, and I can imagine in the moment it wasn't funny, but I do think the story is funny in retrospect. But in the moment, sort of trying to put yourself in his shoes. So Phil Cherry is an actor whose life dream was to do Othello. Was to play Othello, and he finally gets the chance in 2003. And so he's up there every night. He says it's a grueling role. He sweated off 5 pounds every night. And he drank 2 gallons of water before every performance. It's a lot of hard work, this role. And it's emotionally difficult. And read his words, he says, I was always in a rush to get done with Desdemona down before the planes come, because you don't want to hold that moment. I was listening for planes while I'm saying, put out the light, then put out the light. And I'm thinking, oh God, here comes another big plane during my murder monologue. So let me hurry up and get this scene over with before the plane comes. Kurt, the director at the time, always encouraged us to kind of pause the scene, because when the planes come by, you can't hear the words. That's a pause you don't want to take when you're in the middle of killing your wife on stage. So it was, and actually I saw that performance. It was an amazing performance. But so that gives you some sense of kind of the in the park. Act 4 is I did use All the World's a Stage for the title of this chapter. So I did break down and use one of those, but it's because it was appropriate. The company is very committed to community outreach and being involved in many, many ways in the community, everything from its education program, which has served schools in every county in the state, to its traveling parks program, which is seeing 38 parks this year. It's Midsummer Night Dream. Try to catch it when you can. It's got about another month before it's done. To working with cancer survivors, refugees, Shakespeare Behind Bars with prisoners, and Shakespeare with Veterans, which is a program that Amy Attaway runs, working with veterans from they run quite an age range and quite, through many, many conflicts, and kind of using Shakespeare to help them to sort of have hard discussions with each other. And the Shakespeare with Veterans performs every summer in the park. And I had the good fortune of being able to interview one of the longtime members of that program, Mr. Stewart, Darrell Stewart. He was a Vietnam veteran. He actually saw Shakespeare in the park in 1968, the summer before he was called up. And then he was shipped off. So I did hear a lot about his Vietnam experience too. But then he talks about what it means to him and what he hopes it means to the community. I'm just watching watching the clock a little bit. Says, I like Shakespeare because I don't think there's a human emotion anywhere that Shakespeare doesn't deal with in one of his plays. I think that's why he's such a great and gifted author. He has the ability to elucidate human emotion and to portray it in a non-threatening way that everyone can relate to. That is what I like about Shakespeare. He brings out feelings in a very positive way. And this program has been an opportunity to release a lot of feelings that were pent up in me for 46 years. This taught me that they're not exclusive to me. There's nothing wrong with them. Everybody at one time or another has had those feelings. It's been a wonderful release emotionally for me. Also, I would like to think that on occasion, when we do perform in the community, it gives people an opportunity to be a little more aware of what veterans are about, maybe a little more receptive to us as veterans. I think our program helps them to understand that we're just like you. We're all the same here. We're all just people. Let's get together and have fun. And I think that's the value of the program for the community. The other sort of a lot of conversation about the community outreach is about the commitment to diversity and to inclusion. And the theme of inclusion, it really runs through the whole story. That Doug Ramey, his whole goal in the very beginning was to make sure that the kids who lived around Central Park could come and enjoy the play. And Matt Wallace has the story about two young kids who would also always come to rehearsals and then basically give them a critique afterwards. What they liked about that, maybe you want to do that instead. And these were like 8 and 9-year-old kids. If you look at what's interesting is actually the early reviews of the company. There was this one reviewer in the Courier Journal, William Moose, who, I'm like, you're not in the room, are you? Or relatives? Okay, because I'm about to trash you. He hated the company. He hated the park. He hated the atmosphere. He thought it was loud. He thought it was distracting. He thought half these people didn't belong at a Shakespeare play. But he was sort of an outlier, right? Mostly that's what people liked about Kentucky Shakespeare, was that it was inclusive. And that sense of inclusivity remains a big theme today. Over and over again, when people talked about what they thought was important, what they liked about being with the company, it was that idea that they were speaking to everybody. Speaking of what they thought of the company, the last act of the book is, maybe fittingly, ends with reviews. what people thought of Kentucky Shakespeare, about their own experience, and what they think it means for the community. And there is a lot of very touching material in here, which I sort of always tear up on, so I'm not going to read some of those. But people talking about, some of the actors talking about what it meant for them personally, in terms of creating a sense of family after a spouse has passed away or something. There's a couple, well, it is Shakespeare, right? So there's a couple weddings. There's, Matt and Tina Wallace met on the stage of Kentucky Shakespeare doing Midsummer Night Dream, and they got engaged on the stage of Kentucky Shakespeare. There's been several other kind of, very personal stories about what the company means to people. But then they also talk a lot about what it means to the community and sort of why they do it and what they think it brings to the community. And the sort of very consistent theme there is the idea of a arts organization that is committed to not only drawing from the community for the artists, hiring local actors, local painters, local designers, even local graphic artists who do all the posters and such, right? So they're very committed to pulling from the community, but also giving back, finding ways to get more people to the park, partnerships with TARC to hand out bus passes, for example, and kind of just expressing that idea of the mission, right? So I'm going to end with one last quote, and I am going to go back to Braden McCampbell. Let me explain why. So there's sometimes, again, when you're doing oral history, sometimes again, when you're doing oral history, people just have a character, right? And the thing about McCampbell is he's very funny, very profane. I had to do a lot of word editing here and there to kind of clean it up enough so the University Press of Kentucky would be comfortable publishing it. So, but he, I think, has sort of an infectious enthusiasm and that makes his narrations particularly fun. So this is him talking about why they do what they do. They put so much time and effort and love and work into bringing this to the community for free. For free, that is a big deal. I can't stress how big of a deal that one thing is. That means come, bring your kids, bring your wife, bring whoever. This is free. Come and just enjoy it. It takes a lot of work. This is a professional company. This is 7-hour rehearsals. This is money. This is a lot of money. There's a lot of this grant writing that goes into it. There's just so much effort, so much time, but it turns out an amazing product, and it's all for the audience, so they can come and see the show for free. I know a lot of people do not understand just how much effort goes into this, and it's all for one thing, to keep Will free. And it's a labor of love. We do this because we love this community. We do this because we love Louisville. It's also the people, so that the people can come and see it. And I think that kind of that enthusiasm for why they do this was what I was trying to capture, right? Because, it's obviously you can tell I'm a big fan, right? It was a very fun project to work on. This was actually my COVID project, right? I could do it in my living room. I could do it in my study. I didn't have to leave my house. So it was lovely that way. But I think it was particularly because of the language and the use of language, the way they describe things, the way they talk about things was so rich. And maybe reflective of sort of why we love Shakespeare, right? We love Shakespeare because of the richness of the language. And so I'm hoping that comes across and gives people who read the book a little taste of what that's like to be at the park, to experience the performances. And it sort of opens with that, and it closes with that, with the sort of hope that people, as they go home, the play is over, the lights go down. There's usually a little, jig on a little dance on the stage at the end, and then the lights go down. And Monty Pretty, who's been the longest tenured actor with the company, who did retire 2 years ago, but he had been with the company from the beginning up until that. You hear his voice over the loudspeaker, encouraging you to come back. So I hope people do. With that note, I will take questions. Like I said, I saved a lot of time because I like to answer questions. Yeah.
I'm curious, in your research and discussions, did you find any community leaders, politicians, academia who were influenced or either participated or influenced by Shakespeare in the park? And did they talk to you about how that got them interested in arts or anything like that?
Well, some of the people we interviewed who had been in the company then go on to careers elsewhere, right? Shall we say? So Hal Park and John Gatton were both men who, like in the 60s, and actually they were quite young. Actually John Gatton often comes to these. John, are you here? No? Okay. I've seen him in a couple of my talks. They were very young men, not really even intending to be actors, and who were in the performances. And then they go on, Hal Park goes on to direct in other places, to direct productions in other places, especially, what's the one in Horse Cave? He ends up there. And John Gatton goes on to be a Shakespeare scholar. There was another one who goes on to be a Shakespeare scholar. The guy, I can't remember his name, unfortunately. He's not somebody we interviewed, but it was someone people talked about, who started out with the company and then went on to be a Shakespeare scholar. Actually, an interesting interview I did was with Robert Curran, who was the director of the Louisville Ballet. And when he first got to Louisville, he attended, just as an audience member, he attended some of the shows. And then one of his dancers choreographed a piece to Shakespeare sonnets. And so he ends up reaching out and creating a relationship with Kentucky Shakespeare that continues to this day, where they do a ballet every summer. And one of the things that he talked about was that it really kind of opened his eyes to what true community arts could look like, and that influenced how he tried to run the ballet as well. Yeah. Other questions?
I think I'm springboarding off of the review section because I taught Shakespeare to middle school kids. And the first time I began, Kurt Toftelin came to us, and he did a little vignette, and he explained some of the longer quotes, and the longer soliloquies that they had. And he just really got the kids involved in it. And then I just taught it every year, either Macbeth, Hamlet, or Romeo and Juliet. I only did Romeo and Juliet one time with middle schoolers. That was a no-go after that.
Oh, really?
But it was, they really loved it. And I get Facebook comments now from students that I taught in Florida that we did the same sort of, you're going to love Shakespeare. And they're going to go, no, we're not. And I said, yes, you're going to love it. And they send me pictures, the moms do, of them reading Shakespeare now as teenagers. And so it's just, this started with this basic community here and the outreach that they did to the schools. So, it was just, it was a beautiful thing to watch children change, because after they're involved in a drama like this and they go through all the fear, and they're never the same. They're never the same.
Yeah.
So it's lovely.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me fill in a little bit. The education program, there was a sort of rudimentary education program under Becky Jo Schneider, but Kurt Toftelin is the one who really established that as a special program, hired a guy to come in and just do the education program. And one of the things that a couple of people in the company have talked about is that knowing that sort of for a lot of kids in Kentucky, we're their first taste of this. And Abigail Maupin has this great story of being, she and her husband, Greg, they were married before they got here. So we Kentucky Shakespeare cannot claim credit for that particular marriage, but they were actually hired to do the artist educator job, going out around the state and do that. And she talked about trying to work on a scene from Julius Caesar with a high school boys wrestling team. And she said that these kids did not care, they're sitting there leaned back in their seat, they're like doodling. This was before cell phones. So they were doodling and everything. And she says that when she's talking about the scene where Cassius and Brutus are sort of this is it. We're about to go off and fight this war and, what are we going to do about this? And some like young, I think she said he was about 10th grade, wrestling kid explained what that scene was all about. And she said she felt both completely vindicated and completely unnecessary, right? She's like, they just got it. I didn't even have to be there. Of course she had to be there, but she felt like that really had an impact. So. Are you gonna ask me a hard question? No, okay.
I have one.
Mhm.
I joined Shakespeare as a volunteer back when you had to have a membership in the Friends or whatever it was called through a lady by the name of Pat Jenkins, who is no longer with us. Pat was instrumental with the Louisville Orchestra.
Mhm.
But I have several anecdotes, and I wondered, did you include the As You Like It dinners that used to be held as a fundraiser for Shakespeare?
So that was under Becky Jo Schneider, right?
I
Yeah.
probably was. I
Yeah.
didn't realize how important she was
Yeah.
before she went to Derby dinner.
Yeah, oh no, she really, so there's a reference to that she would plan these big events. But not specific, because she did a bunch of different events, but not specifically about those dinners. I have heard of them.
Okay,
But not-
because they ran for a number of years.
Yes, they were
And
big.
one of the anecdotes with Hal Parks was that summer that he had at his home and his wife's home in, I guess, Crescent Hill. But it was the summer that the cicadas were very bad.
Mhm.
And we had an outdoor picnic. And they were falling all over the place. And this summer, since this is a year for the cicadas, I
Yeah.
thought I would tell that little anecdote
Yeah.
about the cicadas and Hal Parks.
Yeah, it's interesting because so Becky Jo Schneider, we have a short interview with her that was done just before she passed away. It was done by another professor who had intended to write a book about Kentucky Shakespeare and then never did. But he had that one interview and he gave it to me, but that's all we had. But we don't have very much from her. So things that happened during her time, we don't have a lot of detail on. But the Hal Park, we have a little bit more of detail about his, and that he also did some other kind of programming. He brought in, he's the first one that hired a dramaturg. And he sort of did like a Shakespeare Institute on a weekend where people could come and learn about Shakespeare. You don't have to be a member of anything now to volunteer. You can just sign up. So just saying. We're always looking for people to just sign up. So, yeah.
I was the executive director in that dark period for a short period of time.
Mhm.
And one footnote was the education side was imperative. I think we had a staff of 4 or 5 ladies,
Mhm.
and only way we could produce the production was via the education program.
Right. Because it paid for it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah.
That was
yeah.
key.
Yeah, yeah, that was a big thing. It was, and it's still a major source of income, not as proportionately not as big as it was then. But yes, that's one of the things is that because the education program has always been a fee service, right? The school systems pay for that education program. And it funded the shows in the summer and everything else. Basically, it funded everything. And so Kurt Tofflin really invested a lot in creating that and expanding that education program. Yeah. They do still, by the way, they actually just got a big grant to do Shakespeare in every school in Jefferson, every high school in Jefferson County the first year, every middle school in Jefferson County the second year. So they will have in-school programming at every school over the next couple of years, funded by a grant, actually, this time. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I really, the sweep and influence of this program is really extraordinary.
Mhm.
I happened to be last night out at Luther Luckett to see As You Like It.
Did you?
Yeah. and
Okay.
that satellite program,
Mhm.
spun off from Shakespeare in the Park is profound and life-changing.
Mhm.
And hugely creative. I mean,
Mhm.
to think to do that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, the sweep is wide.
Yeah. So that's interesting because, so that what she's referring to is the Shakespeare Behind Bars program. Again, Kurt Tofflin started it. And then when he stopped being director, when they had the two directors that came after him and Matt Wallace sort of separated from the company, he got Matt to help him with that. So they sort of made Shakespeare Behind Bars an independent thing. And then Kurt Tofflin has now gone back to where he lives in Michigan now and has created a second one up there. And sort of during COVID, it had to stop. And I think this is the first year back to it. And Christian Wilshire is now, second year back, yeah. Christian Wilshire is now working closely with the Shakespeare Behind Bars. So I should say, I did the book and then I got involved in the committee work. And because I did the book, they asked me to come onto and chair one of their committees. So I always like to clarify that, so. Mhm.
Can you tell us about this year's season?
Yes.
Production?
Yes, so the first one is Romeo and Juliet. And I believe it is set in a Regency period setting, kind of like Jane Austen-y. It starts, opening night is the last Friday of May, so May 31st is opening night. Then the second one is, well, I'll say a little bit. I don't know all the cast, but I do know Juliet is Bibi Patello, which if you saw Midsummer Dream last summer, she was Puck. And she was Viola in 12th Night. She is a brilliant and funny actress. And I think Matt Wallace is directing that, and he's leaning into this idea that a lot of people in Shakespeare circles talk about, that Romeo and Juliet is a comedy until it's not. Right? And so he's sort of playing up some of the comic elements and for part of that with and BB's great at being able to do both of those things. The second one is Comedy of Errors. And this is going to be interesting. So Comedy of Errors is two sets of twins, right? The sort of the sort of straight man twins, romantic lead twins, and the comic servant twins. And usually the emphasis is on the former. This year, Greg Maupin and Brian Hines are playing the comic twins, which I think means that emphasis is going to be on the latter. I'm really excited to see that. And then the third one I think is it's one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, is The Tempest. And he's doing some really interesting sort of half modernizing it, half not kind of thing going on with it. Don't want to give anything away more than that, because it's a very creative and different vision. The ballet will do a week again. I think they're doing Lady Lear, which they did several years ago, and I think they're bringing it back, which is a gender swapped Lear. And I think Cincinnati Shakes is coming down as well. And then they do Late Night Shakes, which is a comedy troupe that does sort of improv based on Shakespeare. So that's the summer season. And of course, they're doing Midsummer Night Dream right now, touring it around different parks. I'm trying to think what's the closest one to here. I don't know what the closest one to here would be. Sorry. Other questions? I'm just not as good as pumping up the enthusiasm for the plays as Matt would be. He's, enthusiasm embodied. So.
Well, no, I think that's the perfect lead in. We
Okay.
know we've got our summer plans. Another round of applause. Thank you so much.
Mhm.